Today, we are wading into some of the darkest source material we've ever really examined in one of these deep dives. We're looking directly at that question that just looms over all serial crime. What truly operates behind the eyes of a person who is capable of such sustained, methodical cruelty?
Yeah.
What is the internal core mechanism that drives a killer, a person that investigators, in this case, chillingly described as a killing machine?
It is. It's a difficult and I think an essential undertaking. When we study the forensic profile of someone like Rodney Alcala, our mission today, it's not really to recount the timeline of his life and crimes.
Right, we're not doing a biography.
No, not at all. We want to dissect the internal logic.
Yeah.
We have to explore this constellation of personality disorders, the paraphilias, the predatory instincts that really fueled his behavior. So we're focused entirely on the how and the mechanics of his cruelty. And we're drawing on, extensive forensic psychiatric assessments and detailed behavioral analyses that were compiled across his many, many trials.
And what immediately strikes you in those reports is just the sheer stunning discrepancy. It's the mask that Alcala wore for decades.
Yeah.
Outwardly, he was this charismatic intellectual, the witty bohemian, the artist. He even appeared on national television on The Dating Game.
It's incredible.
He cultivated this entire public persona, and he often used his camera as this perfect lure. It was a tool of his supposed profession.
That ability to blend in, that camouflage was absolutely central to his longevity as an offender. He wasn't the caricature of the secluded, disorganized killer. He was operating in plain sight. But we have to understand that the charm, it wasn't just a calculated tactic. The clinical analysis shows it was an integral symptom of a severe layered pathology.
So it was part of the disorder itself?
It was. His ability to manipulate and charm was rooted in his diagnoses, not just something he practiced. It was like a pathological requirement that fed his profound ego and that enabled the deeper, darker behaviors. So to understand the level of danger he posed, we absolutely have to analyze this layered pathology, and we have to start right at the foundation.
Okay, so let's unpack this layering, because this profile was, it was painstakingly assembled. This wasn't based on one snapshot in time.
Not at all. It was pieced together over years, drawing from military psychiatric evaluations that go all the way back to the 60s.
Wow.
Yeah, reports from prison psychiatrists during his earlier incarcerations, and then just extensive trial testimony.
Yeah.
And it clearly reveals not just, general instability, but a specific, and lethal combination of mental disorders.
And that blueprint, as you call it, it starts remarkably early. The foundational diagnosis, which the record confirmed, was antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD.
Yes. And critically, this diagnosis wasn't a retrospective conclusion drawn, years after his worst crimes.
Right. It wasn't them looking back and saying, oh, he must have had this.
Exactly. It was first documented by an Army psychiatrist back in 1964. Alcala was just 21 years old, and this was after he went AWOL.
21. That is so young for that pattern to be so set.
It's a crucial detail because it confirms that this pervasive pattern of disregard and psychological deviation was already deeply entrenched in his youth, long before his most notorious crimes.
So ASPD is the framework. It signifies this profound, ingrained pattern of just disregarding and violating the rights of other people. And this is why you see a failure to conform to lawful behavior almost immediately. There's this chronic reliance on deceitfulness, on manipulation as just his default setting in all his relationships.
Precisely. And the core characteristics are they're pervasive. You have chronic impulsivity, irritability, this aggressiveness that often manifested in physical confrontations.
Right.
And a consistent irresponsibility that made any kind of normal employment or relationship just impossible for him to sustain.
But the real chilling part, the one that connects directly to the violence, is the lack of remorse.
The profound and unshakable lack of remorse. Yes. The behavioral experts whose findings are all over these sources, they emphasize that individuals with severe ASPD view other people purely as objects.
Objects for gratification.
That's it. They don't register others as, sentient beings with feelings or dignity or rights. They're merely tools. For Alcala, a victim was simply a mechanism to fulfill his desire for sexual assault, for psychological dominance, or for the execution of a sadistic ritual.
Okay, but if ASPD often leads to poor impulse control, how was Alcala so successful at the camouflage, at the evasion?
And that is the critical nuance that the sources really highlight. It was his high intelligence. See, many people who meet the criteria for ASPD, they struggle to maintain a consistent camouflage because their impulsivity, It just overrides their ability to plan and calculate.
Did I get caught?
They get caught.
Yeah.
They make sloppy mistakes. But Alcala, he possessed a high IQ, and this intellectual capacity allowed him to mask his underlying traits far more effectively than a typical subject. He could plan meticulously, he could articulate these complex rationalizations for his behaviors, and he could manipulate social situations to just neutralize suspicion instantly.
He could mimic normalcy.
He could mimic it perfectly,
Yeah.
which meant his internal pathology was operating under this very sophisticated high-definition disguise.
And this superior self-image, this whole intellectual veneer that pushes us directly into second and equally important diagnosis layered right on top of that. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD.
Yes.
So if ASPD is the machinery for rule breaking and objectification, NPD is the fuel, right? The self-belief, the justification for it all.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
NPD is characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance and absolute unwavering conviction that the subject is special and unique, and a corresponding requirement for excessive admiration from others. This is why that artist persona and the desire for attention, even on the dating game, were so crucial to him.
The entitlement that must be inherent in that, I mean, it must be staggering, especially when you combine it with the objectification of ASPD.
It is absolutely fundamental to how he saw the world. As forensic analysts like Dr. Marcus Levin noted, the narcissist sees the world as revolving around them, as an extension of their own ego.
Everyone else is just an extra in their movie.
Exactly. Every other person exists primarily to feed that ego, to admire, or to serve a purpose. So when you fuse this with the objectification of ASPD, you create a person who genuinely believes they are outside the boundaries of consequence, and that their superior status gives them the right to whatever they desire, whenever they desire it. His charming persona, it wasn't merely practical bait. It was his way of soliciting that excessive admiration that he required to sustain his pathological self-concept.
Before he transitioned into the predatory phase.
Before the hunt began, yes.
And if that admiration was withheld, or if a victim dared to resist or challenge him or just failed to comply, that's when the mask drops, isn't it? And we see the shift from charm to something genuinely lethal.
That is the point of ignition. It's a phenomenon that the sources refer to as narcissistic rage.
Which is different from just being angry.
Oh, it's much colder than a typical burst of anger. It is a calculated, furious response driven by this existential need to punish anyone who dares to threaten the perceived superiority of the narcissist.
Right.
So for a predator like Alcala, a victim's resistance, any attempt to refuse or escape or challenge his authority, that would be interpreted as the most profound insult. It's a total threat to his dominance.
And so that challenge, in his distorted view, warranted this exponential, often lethal punishment.
Yes, that mechanism helps explain the extreme escalation and the focused cruelty we see in his methods. The punishment had to match the perceived injury to his ego.
Before we move on to the really severe diagnoses, I want to circle back on something you mentioned from the source material, the suggestion of traits of borderline personality disorder, or BPD. Why did some experts float this idea, even though it was sort of overshadowed by the other conditions?
That's a really insightful question, because understanding why BPD traits might appear, it helps us appreciate the complexity of the pathology. BPD is marked by a general instability in relationships and self-image and emotional state. It often leads to impulsive behavior and these chaotic life patterns.
And Alcala certainly had a chaotic life.
Oh, absolutely. Going AWOL, periods of paranoia, unstable employment. These secondary traits might have contributed to the general impulsivity we see when he would move so quickly to a new state after a crime. However, the core organized cruelty and the profound lack of empathy that distinguishes him clearly from a primary BPD diagnosis, the extreme focused nature of his sadism and the cold calculation of his psychopathy, they just took precedence. But that underlying instability of BPD, maybe that added to his volatility when things didn't go precisely to his plan.
So this clinical layering, it brings us to the most chilling and consequential diagnosis, the one that really defines his specific lethality. Malignant narcissism with psychopathy and sexual sadism comorbidities.
Yes.
This isn't just a list of 3 disorders. This is a synergy. This fusion is what transformed a disturbed person into a prolific, organized serial killer.
Let's dedicate some time to breaking this compound diagnosis down, because it is the absolute key to understanding his profound dangerousness.
Okay.
Malignant narcissism is where the narcissism we just discussed fuses with the antisocial traits, but crucially it often includes paranoid features and this aggressive, destructive orientation toward the world.
So it's narcissism on steroids, essentially.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It's severely pathological. But the addition of psychopathy, that changes the game entirely.
Psychopathy, which the sources define as the utter absence of empathy, shallow emotions, and pathological lying. It's just the ultimate absence of humanity.
That lack of empathy is the ingredient that makes the narcissist lethal. A run-of-the-mill narcissist, they only care about themselves. But a psychopath genuinely lacks the ability to connect emotionally with the suffering of others.
Right.
That absence of empathy means there is no internal break. There's no moral counterbalance when you're inflicting extreme pain. And you couple that with the pathological lying, which is just a feature of their life rather than a source of stress, and this person becomes definitively a deeply dangerous individual.
So they can commit these unimaginable acts and then just walk away, go about their day.
Completely unaffected by the trauma, the ruin, the death they've caused. Yes.
The psychopathic traits enable the execution of the crime without a conscience, but the source material identifies one final component as the actual engine, the source of the specific perverse motivation.
Sexual sadism.
Yeah.
This is the paraphilia that dictates the precise nature of the cruelty and the ritual. Sexual sadism is the condition where an individual derives sexual arousal, sexual gratification, specifically from the extreme pain, the suffering, or the humiliation of another person.
So it's not enough for the sadist to just overpower the victim or use force.
No, the pleasure is intrinsically linked to the infliction and the witnessing of that suffering.
Dr. Levin, whose analysis appears all through the source material, he describes sadism as the engine of the torture. And this answers that question of why Alcala didn't just kill quickly and efficiently. He had to maximize the agony and prolong the experience.
Absolutely. For the sexual sadist, the homicide itself is the ultimate climax, yes, but the preparation, the psychological terror, the physical torture, that is the main source of gratification. The process is everything. If the victim dies instantly, the gratification is diminished. It's lost entirely. The narcissistic and psychopathic need for dominance merges with the sadistic need for sexual arousal, derived directly from the victim's physical and psychological response to pain.
So the killing isn't a singular necessary step to, end a problem. It becomes highly theatrical.
It becomes a prolonged psychosexual ritual. This means the killer is highly invested in the sequencing, the pacing, the timing of the abuse. It has to be methodical, planned, and repeatable, often with minor variations, to satisfy the specific pathology.
And the key is that he has to actively prolong the victim's suffering.
Right, and not out of unbridled rage. This isn't a frenzy. It's out of a calculated clinical desire to witness, control, and internalize the victim's fear and humiliation. This turns the encounter from a random act of violence into a theatrical production.
Where he's the director.
He's the director. And the victim is forced into a role of ultimate subservience. This ritualistic aspect is vital because it explains exactly why Alcala used behaviors like repeated strangulation and revival. It was necessary for the ritual to achieve its desired peak gratification.
Let's focus on that specific ritual for a moment, the strangulation and revival. What is happening clinically and psychologically when a sadist performs that act over and over? How does that maximize their twisted gratification?
It's the ultimate expression of power and psychological torture. When Alcala strangles the victim to unconsciousness, he is exercising absolute control over their life force. He has demonstrated physically, I can end you. But the revival, that is where the real sadism comes in. By allowing them to revive, he is offering a flicker of hope, that sudden agonizing rush of life back into the lungs.
Wow.
That transition from suffocating darkness back to a painful reality is terrifying. And then realizing the killer is still there, calmly waiting, ready to repeat the act. It destroys that hope it's still in.
It creates a cycle of hope and despair.
Precisely. The cycle confirms his dominance not just over their physical body, but over their very sense of existential security. It heightens the terror exponentially with each repetition.
So he's witnessing their panic, their submission.
And their profound psychological breakdown. This is a deliberate, highly nuanced form of torture that maximizes the feeling of control and satisfies the sexual arousal tied to their suffering. For this profile, it's the highest form of dominance.
So synthesizing these three elements, malignant narcissism giving him the entitlement, psychopathy removing the brakes, and then sexual sadism providing the instruction manual, you really see how a truly high-functioning, prolific offender is created.
It's a closed, terrifying loop. His NPD gave him the entitlement to claim whatever he wanted. His psychopathy removed all emotional and moral barriers. And the sexual sadism provided the specific, perverse roadmap for how the act must be executed to get maximum, repeatable satisfaction. This synergy is what makes him the definition of a killing machine.
And this clinical framework, it allows us to understand why Alcala's methodology involved that chilling signature behavior. He toyed with his victims. That word feels so inadequate, but the reality of what that signified is the ultimate assertion of power.
The term toying only scratches the surface. We're discussing behavior that shows meticulous calculation over a terrifying period of time. We've mentioned the specific ritual detail from the sources, the strangling, the revival, the repetition. This wasn't incidental or disorganized violence. It was the mechanism through which he achieved his core pathological need.
So let's consider the psychological dynamic of that scenario from Alcala's point of view. What did that cycle of control and terror accomplish for him beyond just simple sadism?
It accomplished the ultimate fantasy of omnipotence. By controlling the victim's path to death, he wasn't merely asserting power, he was demonstrating power over the most fundamental force of existence, life and death itself.
He determined the timing of everything.
The timing of unconsciousness, the moment of gasping revival, and the timing of the final expiration. This reduces the victim from a human being into a completely manipulable object, a doll subject entirely to his whim.
It effectively transforms the crime into a psychological performance where he is the only actor with any agency.
Exactly. It makes the victim entirely subject to his control. As forensic analysts suggested, it was like a game of chess with human life, where the checkmate wasn't the point, it was just the conclusion.
Right.
The true enjoyment was derived from savoring every agonizing move that led up to it. The prolonged process allowed him maximum time to internalize the victim's submission and terror, which fueled his narcissistic and sadistic needs.
Dr. Elena Santos's analysis in the sources confirms this approach, and she classifies Alcala within a specific offender type.
Dr. Santos's work is vital for classification. She placed the toying behavior squarely within the definition of a power-assertive, sadistic offender.
And that profile is distinct from other types of killers.
Very distinct. It's different from thrill-seeking or mission-oriented killers. The driving force is the need to exert and feel dominance. The killer views the victim as an instrument upon which to exert total control and superiority.
So Alcala wasn't killing in a frenzy, which would suggest a loss of control.
Exactly. He was, in the profiler's precise words, conducting an experiment in dominance. He was observing and savoring the response to extreme terror, and thereby validating his ultimate godlike power in that moment.
And this inherent need for documentation, for immortalization, that links directly to his use of the camera. It wasn't just a prop for luring victims. It became an essential tool of his pathology.
It's entirely consistent with the sadistic, power-assertive profile. The act of photographing the victim, often posed, often degraded, always subservient, is an attempt to immortalize that moment of total control. He needed a trophy.
Something tangible.
A tangible object that allowed him to relive the high point of the sadistic ritual indefinitely. It's an extension of his power, proving that he commanded that moment, that the victims were completely submissive to his artistic, pathological direction. The photos are the clinical record of his dominance experiment.
And the comparison made in the sources to Ted Bundy. It's really illuminating regarding the level of danger he posed because of this camouflage.
It's a necessary comparison, I think, for public safety awareness. Both were highly intelligent, articulate, and used superficial charm and an attractive public face as the ultimate camouflage.
They defied the stereotype of the obvious monster.
Completely. They presented as trustworthy, engaging, successful individuals who could blend into any social situation, which made them far more dangerous than disorganized offenders.
Right.
Their intelligence allowed for methodical planning, careful victim selection, and sophisticated evasion techniques, ensuring they remained prolific for years. Alcala's mastery of this disguise, fundamentally backed by his severe narcissistic and psychopathic traits, elevated him far beyond the typical criminal. His charm was his most powerful weapon, and his pathology dictated its precise lethal direction.
The sources show that to sustain this level of calculated cruelty, Alcala couldn't just view himself as a common criminal. He needed this elaborate internal fantasy. He reframed torture and murder as an artistic process. What purpose did that fantasy serve for his ego?
This internal justification is maybe the most fascinating aspect of his clinical profile, because it's the mechanism that allowed him to maintain his grandiose self-image while committing these unspeakable acts. The narcissist has to be unique, elevated, misunderstood. If he acknowledged he was merely a brutal sadist, his fragile ego would collapse. By casting himself as an artist and the director of profound human experiences, he achieved that necessary elevation. He was no longer a perpetrator of violence. He was a creator of a sublime, if twisted, reality.
And the language he used to describe his actions, even as it's reconstructed through his philosophical statements to others, it's disturbing precisely because of its high-flown, composed, philosophical bent.
Oh, absolutely.
He refused to use words like murder, calling them crude and lacking nuance.
That vocabulary shift is critical. He actively used terms drawn from the creative arts. Composition, which suggests careful arrangement.
Tension and release.
Tension and release, a fundamental concept in dramatic structure, and the slow, deliberate tightening of the frame. By using this language, he achieved profound emotional and moral detachment from the physical reality of the violence. It ceased to be human suffering. It became an aesthetic object, a canvas, a sculpture, a performance.
And he saw himself as the only one capable of interpreting this art.
Exactly. He viewed himself as the artist who creates it, the director of their final, most truthful performance, and crucially, the only witness. This allowed him to sustain the narcissistic belief that the experience was ultimately for him. The victim's raw, unfiltered fear, in his mind, became a form of ultimate purity or truth. He believed that in their terror, the victims gave him everything and became pure.
That's chillin'.
It suggests he saw fear as the most authentic human emotion, and since he was the architect of that emotion, he alone was worthy to witness it. This twisted self-perception, it serves as the ultimate, impenetrable defense mechanism against any moral reckoning or external judgment.
But how does this artistic fantasy connect back to the physical violence? Is it just psychological cover, or does it actively drive the sadistic ritual?
Oh, it absolutely drives the ritual. The physical violence becomes the medium for his art. When he performs that cycle of strangulation and revival, he is actively creating tension and release. He is composing the victim's death, carefully structuring the emotional impact. The sources underscore that this belief provides him with a powerful internal narrative. He's not committing a crime. He's achieving a difficult, esoteric form of beauty. This means the more extreme the suffering, the more sublime the art becomes in his eyes, which ensures a continued escalation of cruelty.
This internal logic is maybe best illustrated by that powerful symbolic scene described in the source material, the metaphor of the chessboard.
The chessboard is a perfect symbol for the high IQ psychopathic predator. It represents strategy, foresight, and absolute control over the opposition. And the analogy that's described, it's not about the end result, it's about the process. He's not interested in the immediate defeat. He's obsessed with the maneuvering, the anticipation, the slow, unavoidable process of wearing down the opposition.
He spoke of threatening the queen, forcing the opponent to sacrifice pieces, making them complicit in their own demise. That idea of complicity is truly haunting.
It speaks directly to his sadistic need for total dominance and psychological manipulation. He didn't want the victim to just succumb passively. He wanted them to participate in the execution of his will through their fear and struggle.
So the victim, terrified and desperate, will take actions, begging, struggling, complying, that, in his mind, contribute to the inevitable result.
Yes, he forces them into a position where every single move, whether it's physical or emotional, confirms his superior strategy and power. It's the ultimate humiliation to be forced into aiding your own destruction.
And the outcome, the death itself.
In the analogy, the checkmate is almost an afterthought. This confirms that the act of killing was secondary to the process of protracted psychological and physical suffering. The true pathological gratification was derived entirely from the means, not the end.
Wow.
And the final terrifying conclusion from that internal reflection, it summarizes his ultimate view of humanity. The body is just a board, the mind the pieces, and I have always known how to play. This is the core operating belief of the psychopathic sadist. That human life is merely a structure upon which he exercises his superior intellect and will, without consequence or moral restraint.
When a predator operates with this comprehensive level of internal justification, of psychopathy and intellectual superiority, it presents just an unprecedented challenge to law enforcement and the justice system.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly during interrogation. I mean, traditional techniques must just fail against that level of detachment.
Absolutely. Seasoned detectives, they rely so heavily on nonverbal and physiological cues. They're trained to look for signs of stress. Sweating, fidgeting, inconsistent eye contact.
Right, the body's involuntary reaction to guilt.
To guilt and the fear of consequences. But the sources confirm Alcala was a different species entirely. The psychopathic profile dictates the absence of these stress cues.
We hear the direct insight from investigators like Captain Karen Lewis, who described sitting across the table from him, and the picture she paints is terrifyingly calm.
He was described as calm, cool. He maintained eye contact, but it wasn't the shifty, evasive gaze of a liar trying to hide something. It was assessing.
He was studying them.
He was. In essence, he was studying the interrogators, treating the process not as a crisis, but as another arena for intellectual manipulation and performance. This is the hallmark of the high-functioning psychopath. They treat the police as opponents in another one of their intellectual games.
And when he was confronted with hard evidence, for example, the photo of the victim, Robin Samso, found in his locker, a typical suspect would either break down, lash out violently, or immediately try to negotiate.
Right.
Alcala did none of that.
And that's the moment the mask revealed its depth. Instead of flinching, he would often offer that faint, knowing smile. That smile is pure sadism, the pleasure of watching his opponent realize they've been beaten, even with proof in hand. And he would then pivot instantly, launching into a long, rambling explanation about art and perception. He would analyze the photo not as evidence of a crime, but as a piece of composition, using technical or philosophical jargon to intellectually overwhelm and deflect the interrogators.
And what was the goal of those philosophical monologues? Was it just a stalling tactic?
It served multiple calculated purposes. Firstly, deflection. By debating perception, he moved the focus away from his guilt. Secondly, assertion of superiority. He was proving he was intellectually above their mundane concerns about facts and evidence. And thirdly, and most pathologically, he derived immense sadistic pleasure from the frustration he saw in these trained investigators. The sources confirmed the detective's chilling intuition. He enjoyed it. He knew he was 3 moves ahead in this new version of his chessboard game.
This behavior highlights a massive operational challenge for the system. How do you break through the facade when the suspect genuinely lacks physiological stress cues when lying?
It requires an entirely different approach. Because the psychopath lacks empathy and emotional depth, and because their reality is so detached from conventional morality, lying creates no internal conflict or stress.
So polygraphs are useless.
Standard polygraph tests become irrelevant. Investigators have to shift their approach entirely, abandoning emotional appeals and focusing purely on verifiable external facts, strategic deceptions, and inconsistencies in the physical evidence to chip away at his meticulously crafted reality. They had to fight him with intellect and organization, knowing they couldn't appeal to his conscience, because none existed.
And his need for control, it didn't cease with his interrogation or even his conviction. It continued relentlessly from death row.
That continuous need to control the narrative is a perfect, enduring expression of narcissistic grandiosity. Even after the courts had convicted him, he felt compelled to control public and historical perception.
And he did that by writing a book.
He self-published a book titled You the Jury. This wasn't an act of repentance, it was an act of psychological manipulation. He was addressing an imaginary audience posterity, attempting to mold public opinion and override the factual record.
He used it to reinforce that image of the misunderstood intellectual.
Exactly. The book served as his final stage of narcissistic expression. It presented him not as a sadistic killer, but as the brilliant mind, the misunderstood intellectual, and the victim of a corrupt system. Even when facing death, his primary concern was not remorse or repentance, but maintaining the carefully crafted image of the genius who was wronged. It was his ultimate attempt to assert dominance over the interpretation of his own life and legacy.
Stepping back, having dissected all these clinical layers, we return to that fundamental, often unanswerable question, is he born or made? The sources suggest a complex interplay under the well-established biopsychosocial model.
The clinical consensus is explicitly clear on this. There is no single cause. Human behavior this destructive is always the result of a confluence of factors, a cumulative trajectory. We have to look at multiple elements.
Okay.
On the biological side, there's the potential for a genetic predisposition toward psychopathic or antisocial traits, a neurological configuration that might diminish the emotional response centers in the brain.
And on the developmental side, we have significant early trauma cited in his history.
Yes. The specific trauma cited is the early abandonment by his father in Mexico, followed by this difficult, chaotic relocation to Los Angeles. Dr. Marcus Levin's analysis is critical here. that abandonment may have fundamentally disrupted his ability to form secure attachments in early life.
Right.
And without secure attachments, a child develops defensive mechanisms to cope with a world they perceive as unpredictable, hostile, or unreliable.
And for Alcala, those coping mechanisms manifested as narcissistic defenses.
Precisely. The trauma may have catalyzed the development of these narcissistic defenses, an aggressive, grandiose overcompensation designed to protect that deeply vulnerable, traumatized core. If the world is unreliable, he would make himself superior, untouchable, and utterly self-reliant, viewing others only as means to confirm and validate that superior status.
And the psychopathy and sadism then found fertile ground in this isolated, grandiose, defended psyche.
That's the theory, yes.
This brings us to the critical synthesis, the overall configuration described by experts like Dr. Elena Santos as the perfect storm. Let's just summarize how these complex disorders created such a prolific and lethal offender.
This synergy is the non-negotiable takeaway. Each element of his pathology fed into and amplified the others, resulting in an exceptionally efficient and cruel predator.
So start with the high intelligence, that was the enabler.
It allowed for meticulous planning, smooth social infiltration, effective camouflage, and sophisticated evasion of law enforcement. And that's what ensured his longevity as an offender.
The malignant narcissism and psychopathy were the justification and the void.
They removed any moral or emotional barriers. They allowed him to view victims as inanimate objects, eliminating any guilt, stress, or moral calculus when engaging in torture and murder.
And the antisocial traits provided the immediate tools for him to operate.
Exactly. Impulsivity, rule disregard, and superficial charm ensured he could act on his desires quickly, transition seamlessly from fantasy to predatory action, and maintain the composure required to operate without detection.
And finally, sexual sadism was the horrific motivation.
It provided the specific, perverse blueprint for the ritual of torture and dominance, ensuring that the cruelty was focused, prolonged, and sexually gratifying, thereby satisfying his deepest pathological needs repeatedly.
So the conclusion then is that if you remove any one of these elements, if you were disorganized, or if he lacked the sadism, or if he was just a narcissist without the psychopathic coldness,
he would likely have been a different and perhaps less prolific offender.
yes. But together, they created the configuration that generated the killing machine we've been attempting to deconstruct. So we circle back to that initial impossible question. We have meticulously dissected the clinical mechanics. We've traced the pathways of his pathology and the functions of his internal logic. But the true subjective experience of that profound evil, it just remains an abyss.
And this is the essential limitation when studying high-functioning psychopathy.
Yeah.
We, as empathetic observers, we rely on emotional connection to understand motivation.
Right.
But the sources confirm we are mapping onto a psyche that lacks empathy entirely. We cannot understand the why in the traditional sense of understanding a relatable human choice because this was driven by a layered, severe clinical mandate. The goal of forensic psychology ultimately is not necessarily to understand the why in terms we can empathize with, but to understand the how, the mechanism, and the method.
And we have successfully deconstructed the how. We've traced the specific confluence of disorders. We've identified the signature behaviors of dominance and sadism. And we've defined the elaborate artistic fantasy that provided his internal justification.
Rodney Alcala was not a fictional monster. He was a man with a severe, layered, clinical, and horrifyingly human pathology. Recognizing this complexity and the insidious way high intelligence was deployed as camouflage for profound cruelty is terrifying, but absolutely crucial for understanding the depths of predatory behavior.
Absolutely. Now, before we conclude this deep dive, there is one final provocative piece of information documented in the source material that compels us to look beyond the known facts. The existence of hundreds of his photographs, many of which remain unidentified.
Given the deep pathology we've just detailed, his reliance on ritual, his need for total control and documentation, and his history of prolonged evasion, the sheer quantity of unidentified images raises a profoundly terrifying question about the ultimate scope of his manipulation.
If every picture was part of a composition, part of his ongoing experiment in dominance, and if the confirmed list of his victims represents only a fraction of those experiments, what does that massive cache of photographs imply?
It implies that the true extent of his interaction and dominance over potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of subjects over his decades-long career is unknown.
What other intricate games was he playing? What other rituals were performed that we may never uncover, hidden within those shadows of unidentified faces?
That potential scale, the shadow archive of his sadism, it haunts the investigation and reinforces the necessity of understanding the clinical logic that drove him. It forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that the true magnitude of his predatory life extends far beyond the list of known names.
Indeed. It leaves us with the ultimate reminder that knowing the how sometimes only deepens the terror of the unknown. What else? We appreciate you joining us on this deep dive into the clinical pathology and internal logic of Rodney Alcala.
Thank you for listening.